Hello? Hi guys. What's up? Um okay, so today we're going to do some talking. We're going to continue reading in Ms. Eddie by Edwin. Oh, do I have his name here? I think I have his name here. Okay, Miss Eddie, the famous Book of Mary Baker Eddy by Edwin Franton Dakin. Okay, that's who we've been reading from. That's the very famous biography of her. Not her approved one. She has an approved one, which would be fun to read too. But we're going to be learning a little bit about the connections between Christian Science and Hinduism and Vedanta. I have two videos to show. One is very short. The other is a little bit longer. So anyway, let's start by okay. I am on partial shadow ban. It can be hard to find my videos. Sometimes you can't find the first three. If you want to find all my videos in date order, go to vincentbrunoshadowban.blogspot.com. You can find them there. The title of these videos is Christian Science and Judeo-Freemasonry. You're probably not going to hear a lot about Freemasonry and Christian Science here today or at all. But if you want to find the links between Christian Science and Judeo-Freemasonry, go to bewiseserpents.blogspot.com and you can find all the stuff there. Today's thing on Hinduism. Now, I'm going to be starting a blog on Christian Science and Hinduism and criticizing Christian Science as a way to escape Hindu Vedanta. And I will be putting up the book that I'm reading, Ms. Eddie. I have a PDF. I will be putting these two videos up. I will have other videos up there. It's not ready yet, but I did take out the domain. It's christiansciencehinduism.blogspot.com. Give me a little bit to get that up and running. Maybe by the time I finish reading this book or whatever. But yes. So anyway, if you want to contact me or you want information, or if you're an ex-Christian Scientist or an ex-Hindu, ex-Mormon, ex-Jehovah's Witness, I did a big thing on Mormonism. Go to the website. I'm doing Jehovah's Witness next. I'm doing Seventh-day Adventist after that. Their connections to Freemasonry. If you want to know about Seventh-day Adventists, go to butharmlessasdoves.blogspot.com. Their connections to anti-Freemasonry and the Nazis. And anything Freemasonry. Oh, I have a new blog up that's done. It's called islamfreemasonry.blogspot.com. Hold on. islamfreemasonry.blogspot.com. Anyway, sorry, I don't know if I was saying, if you come from any of these backgrounds and you want to contact me or you want more information, it's vincent.bruno.1229@gmail.com, and that's at the bottom of the screen and in the description box. So anyway, let me get started. So we've been reading about Mary Baker, what's been going on with her the last time. She's embroiled in lawsuits now, and she had a lot of students, and they've turned against her, and a lot of them, or she's turned against them. So there's a lot of lawsuits going on. Miss Eddie's lawsuits during this period of her life were so frequent and so regular in schedule that the Boston newspaper began to keep count of them and feature a new one as a matter of jocular interest. This woman is absolutely hilarious. Mrs. Eddy resented their attitude and took a fling at it in the third edition of her book. She proclaimed that in the interest of truth, we ought to say that never a lawsuit has entered in our history voluntarily. The author evidently meant that she never entered voluntarily into a lawsuit. She continued, we have suffered great losses and direct injustices rather than go to law, for we have always considered a lawsuit of two evils the greater. About 2 years ago, the persuasions of students awakened our convictions that we might be doing wrong in permitting students to break their obligations with us. The student who argued this point to us so convincingly offered to make the notes and collect them without any participation of ours. We trusted him with the whole affair, doing only what he told us, for we were utterly ignorant of legal proceedings. It was alleged indirectly in the Newburyport Herald that we caused a bill to be filed in the Supreme Court to restrain a student of ours from practicing mesmerism. That statement was utterly false. It was a student who did that contrary to our advice and judgment, and we have the affidavit of the reluctant plaintiff certifying this this fact. Whenever Mrs. Eddy was accused of unseemingly goings on, she tried to get an affidavit in her defense. If she had such an affidavit from poor Miss Lacertia, no record thereof has been bequeathed to this historian. The year after George Berry had sued Mrs. Eddy for $2,700, Mrs. Eddy herself brought suit in February 1878 against Richard Kennedy. She sought to recover $750 upon a promissory note dated February 1870, just a few months before she and Kennedy had gone to Lynn to practice. The note read as follows: February 1870, in consideration of the 2 years' instructions in healing the sick, I hereby agree to pay Mrs. Mary Baker Eddy Glover $1,000 in quarterly installments of $50 commencing from this day. Richard Kennedy. Kennedy won the suit in appeal, testifying that he had signed the note after already having received 2 years' instruction from Mrs. Glover Eddy, and only on her assurance that he had more healing secrets. She had not already imparted to him. Such further secrets, says Kennedy, were never disclosed. The lower courts allowed Mrs. Eddy $768.63, but the judgment was reversed on appeal and the decision given to Kennedy. 2 months later, Mrs. Eddy filed another suit. This time it was the action against Tuttle and Stanley, the two early students who had agreed to pay her a 10% annual royalty if they practiced and a $1,000 forfeit if they did not. This action was no more successful than the one against Kennedy. In this same month, April 1878, Mrs. Eddy brought action against Spofford to collect royalties on his practice under an agreement similar to that which she had made with Tuttle and Stanley. This suit was dismissed. In May of this year came the witchcraft suit against Spofford, and then as if there were not enough litigations for season, when October came, Asa Gilbert Eddy and Edward J. Aarons were arrested for conspiracy to murder. It was alleged that their extended victim was Daniel H. Spofford. For some unexplained reason, Mr. Eddy, after marriage, reversed his names. Baptized Gilbert Asa, he took the arrangement of Asa G. The mystery behind that simple rearrangement is no greater than the mystery in one of the most unusual murder cases that ever received space in a Boston newspaper, for it was murder and without a victim. In October 1878, the disappearance of Daniel Spofford was announced in the Boston Herald, with the fact that his friends were alarmed. Some days later, the paper said that his body had been found and was laying at the morgue. On the 29th of the month, the paper was able to announce exclusively to its readers that Messrs. What's MESSR? MESSRS apostrophe period. Something Eddy and Aarons were under arrest. Aarons was a young carpenter who, after the defection of Spofford, had become Mrs. Eddy's star pupil. There was only one flaw in the murder story. There was no corpse delicti. The corpse at the morgue was not the victim's corpse. Mr. Spofford was found alive and well and quite as puzzled as apparently everyone else concerned. Mrs. Eddy's hostility towards Spofford had been most freely expressed. She had openly denounced him as a malpractitioner in a paid notice in the local paper, and there is evidence that her students were treating him in the hope that some unfortunate blight would descend upon him. Her hatred of Spofford was now so great that she even walked the floor with it at night, crying that his mind was pursuing and seeking to enfold and crush her own, and that she could not shake it off. Mr. Eddy, submerged as he was, could not help being affected by these terrible scenes. He was known to have declared that Spofford ought to be punished for so persecuting a helpless woman. Osaji took his ideas from his wife, and when she was convinced that Spofford was causing all this, meek little Mr. Eddy believed her version as a matter of course. Poor Spofford, on his side, was almost equally harassed. He bore no ill will against his teacher, and indeed, until the end of his days, regarded her gratefully as one who had brought into his life its most illuminating truth. Years afterward, when he was an old man of around 65, he said of Science and Health, "I believe it is the greatest book in the world outside the Bible. I don't wish it to be understood that I have said Christian Science was Quimbyism. I said that Mrs. Eddy taught that some of Quimby's doctrines when I knew her in 1870. Spofford, although he knew some of Mrs. Eddy's shortcomings, regarding her as a woman with an important message, and was amazed and horror-stricken at her strange fury. He was the more amazed when a man called at his Boston office, introduced himself as James L. Sargent, a saloon keeper, and inquired if Spofford knew two men named Miller and Libby. Spofford did not. "Well, they know you," said Sargent, "and they want to put you out of the way." The saloon keeper explained that these two men had offered him $500 to do the murder, paying him $75 in advance, not desiring to take the risk to which a murder is subject. Sargent explained that if Spofford would depart from the town for a few days, the necessity of a murder could be avoided, and he could still collect the $500 before his employees learned the actual status of the intended victim. Spofford, frightened out of his wits, immediately conferred with State Detective Holland C. Pickham and then departed from town. Sergeant Therapin informed his two patrons, who he later identified in court as Eddy and Ahrens, that the murder was a fait accompli, and so the later court evidence said collected some more money. Shortly thereafter, Spofford turned up again, reassured his friends, who he had meanwhile become most anxious, and Messrs. What is that? Mrs. and Misters Eddy and Ahrens were held for trial on charge of conspiring to procure murder. Mrs. Eddy inwards wrote her own view of the ensuing event in the 1881 edition of Science and Health, for she regarded this book for years as a sort of personal house organ. She took occasion to denounce the whole murder proceedings vigorously. It was her indignant conclusion that the principal witness for the prosecutions were convicts and inmates of houses of ill fame in Boston. And this was true. The main witness for the prosecution, James Sargent, had a sister, Laura, who kept a pretentious establishment on Bowker Street and appeared in the court attended by a bevy of her girls. The testimony given by Sargent was that Eddy and Ahrens had bargained extensively with him before the $500 price was agreed on, and also argued over the amount of the first down payment. He said Ahrens directed him to Spofford's Boston office to give him one of Spofford's advertisements. One Jesse MacDonald, who had lived in the Eddy's menage as housekeeper for 8 months, testified to having heard Mr. Eddy say that he would be glad to see Spofford out of the way, since he kept Mrs. Eddy in agony. Laura Sargent testified that Ahrens had met her brother James in her establishment several times, and that after one of these meetings, James gave her $75 to keep for him. One George Collier testified to having heard Eddy and Arena discuss the murder plot. The case had been brought for examination before Judge May of Municipal Court on November 7th. After hearing the witnesses, the judge concluded that the case was rather anomalous, but that the evidence warranted holding the accused for the Superior Court, and he fixed their bail at $3,000 each. When the case was called the Superior Court in December, an indictment was found on 2 counts, the accused pleading not guilty. The indictment was then continued until January term of this court, but the case was never tried. Filed with the papers was the notice that the district attorney, Oliver Stephen Esquire, says he will prosecute this indictment no further on payment of cost, which are thereupon paid, and said that Aarons and Eddy are thereupon discharged January 31st, 1879. Mrs. Eddy hastened to reach for her pen and explain the whole affair as a result of animal magnetism or demonology, diabolically conceived to ensure the sale of science and health. Hello? Yeah, science and health. The purpose of this plotter was to ensure the reputation of metaphysical practice and to embrace us for money at a time when they hoped to cripple us in the circulation of our book. She immediately proceeded to publish affidavits in intending to show that Mr. Eddy was entirely innocent. Hold on one second. Christian Science, 1 second. Hold on 1 second. Two of these affidavits made by her students testified that Miss Eddy was teaching in class at a time when she was supposed to have been arranging for the murder. The third was made out by Collier, who testified to overhearing a meeting between the plotters. Collier, in this affidavit, retracted his previous testimony. Today, the whole incredible affair still remains a comic opera mystery. The series of unfortunate legal battles, regardless of their various outcomes, ended in making Mrs. Eddy's position in Lynn rather unbearable. Originally tolerated by her neighbors with a fairly harmonious regard because of her somewhat quixotic eccentricities, she was now made the object of some active hostility, and the many stories of her constant conflicts with students and raging scenes which occurred in her household and her difficult disposition were repeated frequently. Mrs. Eddy was to have one more important lawsuit before this sort of unfortunate publicity ceased. After the quashing of the murder charge, Mrs. Eddy began to feel a deep resentment towards Arenas, which grew with time. Its underlying basis was probably no more logical than many more of her eccentric and sudden whims of dislikes. Arenas, in return, was slowly becoming rather tired of Mrs. Eddy. He developed himself more and more to his own practice and ceased to be a feature in Eddy's establishment. Opening a Boston office, he developed a less vindictive doctrine than which Miss Eddy preached, and in 1881 published a pamphlet entitled Theology, or the Understanding of God as Applied to Healing the Sick. In this work, he quoted long passages from Science and Health and from Quimby, writing a preface in which he disclaimed all originality for the doctrines presented, saying that it had been practiced not only by Mrs. Eddy and Quimby, but also by Jesus and his disciples in the 14th century by secret associations of priests known as the Gottesfreund. He acknowledged his debt to Science and Health by saying that he had included in his treatise some thoughts contained in a work by Eddy. Hold on 1 second. Hold on 1 second. Hold on. When the third edition of Science and Health appeared a few months later, Asa Eddy himself wrote a preface in which Arenas' name was added to the list of those whom Mrs. Eddy had officially prescribed. He said that it would require ages and God's memory to make the ignorant hypocrite who publishes the pamphlet originate its contents. He knows less of metaphysics than any decent, honest man. Henceforth, Mr. Arenas was credited by Mrs. Eddy with seeking to destroy her by the same malicious animal magnetism currents which she thought emanated from Kennedy and Spofford. It was her idea that she could distinguish between the various currents sent out by three men and know when she felt one of her spells coming on her, which one of the three major enemies was at that moment attacking her. Mr. Arenas' attacks, she said, afflicted her as if she were seeking to poison her with a dose of arsenic, and on such occasions she would announce that she was seeking to defend herself mentally against arsenic poisoning. Okay, let's watch. This is by Hindu Academy, I think. Christian Science and Hinduism. It's 3 minutes long.
What is the correlation or the difference between Christian Science and Hindu theology?
Yes, good. You see, in fact, when I was a youngster, I came to this country to study. One of my neighbors, a young lady called, well, elderly lady called Lucy, was a devout Christian Science follower. And we used to have a lot of discussion. That is why I know a little bit about it. This particular movement started about 100 years back, I think 1910, 1900, I would say, whereby one Christian lady, a very devout Christian lady, I think her name was Mary Eddy Becker, was struggling with a serious illness. And then she was reading the Bible, and somehow certain passages in the Bible seemed to lighten her up, and she seemed to have tremendous power on her own body and recover. So she said, this is interesting because it appears that the scriptures can, in a way, thrill somebody to recover from serious illness. And this is how Christian Science began. By the way, Nishit Bhai, we must not mix up Christian Science with Scientology. It's a different game.
A totally different thing, yes.
You may be aware. I have a lot of respect for Christians, for Christian Science. The reason is because they are saying the following. They are saying they are in effect, kind of hanging onto a Platonic view of the world. It's saying that the mind is a very important aspect to the way we interact with the reality. The only way is they're saying that everything is in the mind. Even the material world is in the mind. The diseases are in the mind. Illnesses are in the mind. So if we can have strong control of our mind through devotion or whatever, then we can overcome our problems, including health problems, especially health problems. This was their intention. So this is the way this particular movement developed. It is now slowly disappearing, I'm sorry to say, but it has a lot of selling points. Where do Hindus stand with Christian Science? Let me tell you.
Yep.
The Hindu philosophy says Christian Science is actually called solipsism in technical terms. Means it says everything is in the mind. There's no material world at all. Everything is in the mind. The matter, material, everything is nothing but, if you like, a mind itself. There's nothing more. It's just mind underpinning everything. Full stop. Hindus say no. We say there's a gradation. There is a physical reality. There is a mental reality, there's an intellectual reality, and there's something even higher than that called a spiritual reality. So we agree with the mind is an important aspect to the way we interact with the rest of creation. So mind plays an important role. We understand that. I mean, everything that we talk about is actually nothing but, if you like, our mind telling us, interpreting reality in front of our eyes. So we agree with Christian Science to a certain extent, saying that mind has tremendous power. And if you can harness the power of the mind, you can bring about, definitely you can bring about, healthy change, in your health condition. When we believe, in fact, we always said that if you meet a person who is like highly enlightened and has got tremendous power on his mind, of his own mind, he can bring about major changes in the health of somebody who goes and comes across, to him saying, please help me. It is possible. We agree with that. So that part we agree, but we don't go all the way saying that everything is in the mind. We say, no, there are lots of different layers to our being, physical, mental, intellectual, etc. So we are not saying everything is in the mind. We're saying mind definitely has can make a serious contribution to the way the physical world operates.
Okay, I hope that wasn't hard to hear. I noticed I had my microphone on, and so you would hear things in the background. I hope it was fine. Okay, that was just a short video, just like that. Think what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna read a little bit more. I have another video to show that it'll be about 45 minutes or something like that. So let me just, if I, hold on one second. I read this now. Yeah. Okay. Things went on in this fashion. Mrs. Eddy became constantly more wrought up over the thought of Aaron's and constantly more resentful of his quoting her in his pamphlet until in 1883 she brought an action against him for infringing her copyright on Science and Health. It was in this suit that she acquired the extensive information about copyrights which served her so fortuitously in later years and played no small part in making her a millionaire. She won the Aaron's suit. Aaron's defense was that Science and Health was not original with Miss Eddy, but that it was derived to a large extent from the writings of P.P. Quimby. Such a defense was obviously to no avail in a court of law, for Quimby's writings had never been copyrighted by himself. None had ever been published by anyone except Mrs. Eddy, and the copyright on this material was now owned by Mrs. Eddy personally. Thus, Mrs. Eddy was victorious, and ever after chose to construe this decision as one wholly establishing her claim to the sole and unique discovery of Christian Science, referring to it as her vindication in the United States court. Actually, of course, the decision meant nothing of the sort. Even had Arenas possessed the Quimby manuscript to offer in evidence, it is possible that he would have lost the suit, for Miss Eddy had established her copyright with the Quimby material languished in desk drawers. Arenas was enjoined not to publish or circulate his pamphlet, and all printed copies were ordered destroyed. George Quimby had no time during his life ever permitted these manuscripts of his father's to go out of his possession, even when Miss Eddy's denials of any debt to Quimby assumed the form of a challenge. This challenge, set from the Boston to the Portland Daily Press over her own signature, was as follows, the italics being the biographer's. Mr. George A. Quimby, son of the late Phineas P. Quimby, over this own signature and before witness, stated in 1883 that he had in his possession at the time all of the manuscripts that had been written by his father, and I hereby declare that to expose the falsehoods of parties publicly intimating that I have appropriated matters belonging to the aforementioned Quimby, I will pay the cost of printing and publishing the first edition of those manuscripts with the author's name, provided that I am allowed first to examine said manuscripts, and I do find that they were his own compositions and not mine, that were left with him many years ago, or that they have not since his death in 1865 been stolen from my published works. Also, that I am given the right to bring out this one edition under the copyright of the owner of said manuscript, and all the money accruing from the sales of said books shall be paid to said owner. George Quimby utterly ignored the challenge, and Quimby's followers pointed out that Mrs. Eddy's pronouncement was obviously George Quimby utterly ignored the challenge, and Quimby's followers pointed out that Mrs. Eddy's pronouncement was obviously put out with the hope of getting these documents in her possession, so that under the term of the challenge, she could herself sit as judge and jury and declare that all of Quimby's manuscripts were her own, that were left with him many years ago. Mrs. Eddy no longer hesitated to claim that if there existed any similarity between her own and Quimby's manuscript, it was because of what Quimby had borrowed from writings she left with him in 1862. She asserted this boldly in her pamphlet, Historical Sketch of Metaphysical Healing, which she published in 1885. George Quimby, although he allowed various interested persons to consult these documents, always refused to take any step whatever that would permit Miss Eddy to lay her hands on them. The manuscripts were not made available to the general public until 1921, 11 years after Mrs. Eddy's death. George Quimby denied without making any provisions for their publication. Miss Eddy's death. George Quimby denied without making any provisions for their publication, but they came into the hands of Horatio W. Dresser, who thereupon published them in his volume, The Quimby Manuscripts. George Quimby was unwilling to have them published during Mrs. Eddy's life because of a very frankly expressed distrust of her. He eventually became a distinguished and rather wealthy citizen and was undoubtedly a difficult antagonist for Mrs. Eddy and her organization to handle. In 1888, he explained his attitude toward Mrs. Eddy as follows in a letter written to A.J. Schwartz, a mental healer in Chicago, who had offered to come and to rescue Mr. Quimby's father. If I were in prison in solitary confinement for life, I should be too busy to get into any kind of discussion with Mrs. Eddy. I have my father's manuscript on my possession, but I will not allow them to be copied nor to go out of the hands. Answering your further inquiries, I have no written article of Mrs. Eddy's in my possession, nor did my father ever have, nor did she leave any with either of us. In fact, we both have been able to make a living without stealing. In a rather lengthy statement prepared for the New York World in May 1907, shortly after Sybil Wilbur had interviewed him for her inspired biographical articles in Human Life, Mr. Quimby said of his father's manuscripts, "If the fair, or rather the unfair Sybil, can make herself or anybody else believe that I do not possess them, after I have seen them herself, after having seen them herself, why, I shall have to bear the cross as best I can and go down to the grave with the knowledge that father did not write the manuscripts, which I know he did write because I saw him do it. Sybil says he didn't, and of course she ought to know because she knows nothing about it anyhow. The above statement is what is called logic, and it is useless to butt your head against it. The writings I possess now belong to me. They have either been in the possession of father or myself since some years before Mrs. Eddy ever saw father. Therefore, I find it awful hard to make myself really believe that they are the manuscripts of Mrs. Eddy left with him, when as a matter of fact she never left any, or that she gave him the idea contained in the manuscript several years before they ever saw each other, or that she ever had such ideas. I have never paraded these writings before the public. I have elected so far not to publish them. I have allowed parties to examine them under certain restrictions, as I have a perfect right to do. I allowed Sybil the same privilege, as she is the first person in 40 years to doubt their authenticity, and she only doubted with her pen, for she knew they were just what I told her they were, and that they were authentic when she made her pen say they were not. And I'll bet her pen turned red in the face when it expressed that doubt. George Quimby took particular exception to the statement that he hesitated to produce the manuscript because while he himself was a polished and educated and refined man, old P.P. Quimby had been quite illiterate, in sharp contrast to the son. So George Quimby wrote, "Now I like to have all that's coming to me, but really, father, what was not so illiterate, and I am not as educated and refined as the article would intimate. In fact, if I could today swap personalities with my late father, looks, character, brain, intellect, in fact, every quality that goes to make up a man, I would pay liberal boots and think I had made a good trade. Could we both have audience with the president today? Could we both have audience with the president today? You would see me as a sort of wallflower wandering from the room, looking out of the window or examining the souvenir postals and attracting no attention, while the old gentleman would be the center of attention, monopolizing most of the conversation and attention. And when we left, the president would think that he had been conversing with a cultured gentleman, remarkably well posted on most any subjects, and who knew how to appear in the presence of any company that he might be thrown in with. And he probably would not remember that I had been in the room, unless I had accidentally sneezed. Mr. Quimby's animadversions on the fair, or rather the unfair Sybil, form a sample only of the more genial altercations that has raged around the Quimby manuscript. The greater part of the controversy, particularly in Mrs. Eddy's side, was steeped in bitterness and bile, and Mrs. Eddy came to regard all revelations touching the source of her doctrine as another phase of the persecution which haunted her. Had she had the generosity of soul, which is not uncommon even among those who walk in the humbler paths of life, she would have admitted her debts and might have built on this foundation an unshakable structure, high and serene. In every way, her career would have been a far more satisfying human achievement than all men, regardless of their creed or philosophy, might have accorded her the free, sincere, admiring affection which is ever the historical reward of the successful torchbearer. But intellectual honesty was not a part of the strange of the strange Eddie character. In Lynn, even those students who had been most loyal were gradually disillusioned and dismayed. Mrs. Eddy found herself facing not merely the openly expressed hostility of her neighbors in the town, but the distrustful watchfulness even of her closest students. A number of students had fallen away, utterly discouraged by the perennial conflicts, the constant assaults of malicious animal magnetism, the unexpected gyrations of Mrs. Eddy herself, who could generate at one moment the tranquil sunshine of warm June day, and the next the fierce vagaries of an electric storm. As students declined in number, finances shrank in volume, and Mrs. Eddy was now obliged to do the greater part of her own housework, even to the washing and scrubbing. Poor Mrs. Eddy, who never had possessed any great energy of mind or power of will, was now reduced by his fear of animal magnetism to an almost solemn condition. His wife, Mr. Eddy, poor Mr. Eddy, who never had possessed any great energy of mind or power of will, was now reduced to his fear of animal magnetism to an almost somnolent condition. His wife was a woman who often rose to her best moments under stress of attack. Mrs. Eddy merely became hopelessly dullied. Mr. Eddy merely became hopelessly dullied. He was constant in his efforts to please her and in anticipate her whims, but she showed an increased annoyance at his slowness, his round awkwardness, his rather rustic manners and appearance. It is related that he became deeply discouraged under the stress of these strange goings on, and once in a burst of confidence to another student, Mrs. Rice said that Mrs. Eddy could not be pleased by God Almighty himself. It is worth noting that Mr. Eddy, regardless of his wife's theology, always thought of God in the masculine gender. Mrs. Eddy's own maladjustments to the world around her was increased by another delusion, with psychiatrists often find associated with delusions of perception, and which is not an uncommon phenomenon. This was the delusion of her personal grandeur. As she grew in teaching experience and years, she came to demand explicit obedience of all her students and sought even to regulate their personal lives. The genesis of their general supervision over her students' affair undoubtedly lay in the theory that in order to practice Christian Science efficiently, they must obey the teacher's ultimatums regarding the smallest detail of life. For it was Mrs. Eddy's teaching, of course, that her health system was not psychology, but theology, and the convert must live a life under standards established first by the Christ and thereafter promulgated in 1866 by Miss Eddy herself. And Mrs. Eddy was judge and jury in decisions as to whether such standards had been maintained by a student, and she did not hesitate to interfere in a student's family affairs. She justified such an interference as time went by on the grounds of her own divine inspiration. One of the members of the early circles in Lynn, Miss Ellen A. Locke, said in after years that Mrs. Eddy was the unhappiest woman I ever knew. She was always imagining that someone was conspiring against her. She said that she and the Pope in Rome were infallible and could do no wrong. Even as Mrs. Eddy was washing down the stairs in the absence of a housekeeper and of the previously faithful students who attended to such chores for the house and its tenants, she could find release from reality around her by letting her mind dwell on her eminence as the bearer of divine message. The conviction that she was playing a miraculous role had by now assumed a larger place in her release psychology, and she told her classes many times how much driving through Boston in an open carriage she had healed a cripple who came up to her carriage as it crossed the street merely by putting out her hand. She also announced to her students the discovery that when she was in the house, her houseplants could live without either sunlight or water. She could put them up in the attic, treat them mentally, and behold them flourishing just as before. Unfortunately, Mrs. Eddy was never able to demonstrate over herself, and the Broad Street house was kept in more or less constant turmoil by the uncertainty as to when she would have her next seizure. On some occasions, she would send for those of her students in whom she had most confidence, and have them try to treat her. Mrs. Rice, who expecting Miss Rawson was the only student who had borne with her from the beginning, was apparently more successful than any other in handling her difficulty her during these attacks, and was sent for at all hours of the night. We are told that Mrs. Eddy turned to morphine to try to relieve her terrible seizures. Mrs. Rice, who had long lent Mrs. Eddy far more than mere moral support, since she had her husband had put up poor Miss Eddy's bail during the murder trial, has been quoted by New York World in the following words: "I was on one of Mrs. Eddy's first converts and associates. I have treated her hundreds of times. I know that Mrs. Eddy was addicted to morphine in the 70s. She begged me to get some for her. She sent her husband, Mr. Eddy, for some, and when he failed to get it, she got it herself and locked herself in the room for 2 days and excluded everyone. She was a slave to morphine. She talks so much about the evil eye and devils that she caused one of the younger children of the James Howard, who lived in the lower part of the house, to have fits. For this reason, Howard moved out." Mrs. Locke similarly has testified. Mr. Locke similarly has testified to Mrs. Eddy's use of morphine, which, as in old John Vaney's time, still seemed to have made her crazy. So discouraged did a number of her remaining students. So discouraged did a number of her remaining students become, so appalled by the prevailing atmosphere in a group of workers who were professing to cure all human ailments through a realization of divine love, so convinced that they were being led not by the emissary of God, but rather by a very foolish, grasping, unbalanced woman, that they decided to resign in a body. Okay, let's watch the next thing, which is Christian Science. I'll tell you in a second. Okay. It's called Christian Science and Vedanta, reading on Swami Abhedananda. Swami Abhedananda. So hold on.
Understand something of this principle when they said in the song Celestial, according to an old prose translation, "The wise neither grieve for the dead nor for the living. I myself never was not, nor thou, nor all the princes of the earth, nor shall we ever hereafter cease. And old age, so in some future frame, will it find the like. One who is confirmed in this belief is not disturbed by anything that may come to pass. The sensibility of the faculties giveth heat and cold, pleasure and pain, which come and go and are transient and inconstant. Bear them with patience, for the wise man whom these disturb not, and to whom pain and pleasure are the same, is formed for immortality."
Yes, so it would probably be reasonable to assume, although I haven't been able to verify this yet, that she was very familiar with Emerson and Thoreau and other intellectuals of the New England area that had been studying some of the Hindu scriptures, since that was her kind of area where she was working. And so in environment, she would have been very open about these ideas of looking at other faiths and ideas and philosophies and so forth. And then later on, as it points out, some of the later editions, they began to take some of those things out. But it's quite possible that she was very familiar with those ideas, perhaps had discussions with many of those people of the early transcendentalists. All right, let's continue.
This is a quotation from one of the old translations of the Bhagavad Gita by Charles Wilkins, published in London in 1785 and in New York in 1867. In recent editions of Science and Health, this has been omitted, perhaps to show that the founder of Christian Science did not draw the water of truth from any other fountain than the Christian Bible. Now let us compare the leading propositions of Christian Science with those of the Vedanta philosophy. The 193rd edition of Science and Health, these propositions are said to be 4 in number. First, God is all in all. Second, God is good. God is mind. Third, God, spirit, being all nothing is matter. Fourth, life, God, omnipotent. Good, deny death, evil, sin, disease. Disease, sin, evil, death. Deny God, omnipotent, good life. Which of the denials in proposition 4th is true? Both cannot be true. These 4 propositions form the 4 main pillars upon which rests the structure of Christian Science. A critical student of philosophy, however, can reduce these 4 to 2. First, accept God, who is spirit, mind, life, being, omnipotent, good, and all in all. Second, deny matter and that which exists besides God. According to Christian Science, God, spirit, life, mind, being, omnipotence, infinite good, all these terms are synonymous and are applicable to one real substance of the universe. In the same manner, matter, sin, disease, ignorance, error, and illusion are also synonymous terms which can be applied to that which exists as distinct and separate from the God of Christian Science. It has no existence, no reality. Therefore, the whole phenomenal world with its innumerable appearances does not exist in reality. It is like a mirage, an illusion or dream of the immortal mind, dream of the mortal mind. But the mortal mind itself falls under the head of illusion too, because we read in page 8, 183rd?
183rd edition.
183rd edition of Science and Health. Mortal mind implies something untrue, and therefore unreal. As the phrase is used in teaching Christian Science, it is meant to designate that which has no real existence.
It's amazing. I wonder how many editions there have been since then. I mean, this was 100 years ago, probably over 100 years. I think she was still alive when he gave this lecture. She died in 1910, I think, or something like that. So she very well may have been still been alive. She lived to be 89. But yeah, she had a very long life, and there was a huge organization and very successful at that time. And there were many incidences of remarkable healings from the people adhering to the ideas of Christian Science. But of course, they were rather strict in their views too. They didn't like people trying anything else or doing Christian Science and, say, standard medicine. So there was somewhat of a rigidity there. But still, the power of prayer and the power of mind over matter was demonstrated over and over again by many of her followers. And even when I was doing their testimony services. There were a few incidents that people would relate to in that respect. All right, let's continue. These are long paragraphs, so we're stopping every once in a while in the middle because they go on forever. Okay.
The world is an illusion that is seen by the illusion of the mortal mind. The question arises, whence comes this illusion? What causes it? Christian Science does not answer. It simply says, mind or God is not the author of matter, and the creator of ideas is not the creator of illusions.
And of course, we also have to remember that she's deliberately trying to relate to a Christian audience and trying to convince them of these ideas in a totally Christian context. So she's going to have to put it in ways that they can understand. That she's not talking to philosophy students in a university or people that are interested in Eastern philosophy. So everything she says is put in terms that come from the Bible and are understandable by people from that frame of reference. But Swami Abhedananda is going to point out some of the differences in the way she puts it and the way Vedanta would put it. And it's good for us to hear these things because it shows us a little bit more of the nuances of Vedanta that we might ourselves miss if we weren't comparing it and contrasting it with the way other people put it. All right, let's continue.
Mind or God is not the author of matter, and the creator of ideas is not the creator of illusions. Thus, according to Christian Science, if God is spirit, life, being, absolute, omnipotent good, be all in all and truth, then the phenomenal universe, including matter and mortal mind, is nothing but an illusion. It does not exist in reality. It has no reality and no existence. Now let us see what the Vedanta philosophers said on this point, centuries before the birth of Christ. In this pre-Christian era, a disciple went to a spiritual master and asked, "Sir, please tell me in a few words the fundamental principles of the Vedanta philosophy." The spiritual master, who was the seer of truth, replied, "I will tell you in half a couplet the fundamental principles of the Vedanta philosophy that have been declared by millions of volumes. Brahman, or the absolute infinite and eternal being, is truth. The world is false or unreal, and the individual soul is no other than Brahman, or the absolute truth, which is absolute existence, intelligence, and bliss. This is the quintessence of Vedanta philosophy." In Christian Science, the word God is used to signify the absolute reality or unchangeable truth of the universe. So in Vedanta philosophy, the Sanskrit word Brahman is used to designate that all-pervading substance of absolute being, which is the reality of the universe. This unchangeable reality of the universe furthermore forms the reality of all living creatures and all mortal things, everything that we can see, hear, or perceive with our senses. If Brahman, or the absolute being, whose nature is absolute existence, intelligence, and bliss, the one reality and all in all, it must be one, because there cannot be many absolutes or infinites. Absolute must be one, and infinite must be one. As we find this idea in reading Science and Health, so we find it also in the Vedanta philosophy. Granting then that the absolute reality is one, the question naturally presents itself, why do we see great a variety in the phenomenal universe? And what is the cause of this variety?
So this is the ancient problem of understanding these things. Wasn't it Swami Turiyananda that said that Brahman alone is real and all is Brahman. So even the phenomenal world, in some sense, is a manifestation of Brahman, but it's not thought of as having the reality as the absolute Brahman, because it's a temporary reality and it's changeable, and the nature of Brahman is unchangeable. So it gives the nature of the reality or the nature of the world a certain level of reality, but and as Shankar himself says, Maya can't be said to be completely unreal or real. It's some peculiar mixture of both. And that's a very hard concept to get across. And so it's interesting to see how he goes through these ideas in this particular lecture where he's comparing it with Christian Science. All right, let's continue.
In answering this question, the Vedanta philosophy gives two theories. The first is the theory of illusion. The second is the theory of evolution. The theory of illusion is very old. We find it formulated in the Vedas, and it was taught by some of the seers of the Vedic period. It was maintained and preached by Buddha, who lived 540 years before Christ, and by his followers. Well, later it was explained with great clearness by Shankaracharya, the best exponent of the Vedanta philosophy, who lived in India in the 7th century after Christ. This theory of illusion is the most difficult of all theories for the ordinary mind to grasp. Even the subtlest logicians and the profoundest thinkers often fail to understand how the phenomenal world, which we perceive with our senses, and which appears so real to us, can be unreal or illusory. If, however, Vedanta philosophy declares the phenomenal universe to be unreal and false, it does not deny its existence, as does Christian Science. It does not say that mortal mind or matter is nothing, but to the contrary, is most careful to define the terms unreal and illusion. By these words, Vedanta philosophy does not mean negation, the phenomenal or relative existence or reality, conditioned by time and space. It admits that this phenomenal world is unreal from the standpoint of the absolute or noumenon. At the same time, it says that it has as much conditional reality in it as anything presented to us by the senses can ever have.
Yes, I remember when I first heard John Dobson's talks, and he puts everything in terms of astronomy and physics and chemistry. And that was very new to the monastery at that time, but not new to Vedanta. I'd grown up here. But I always did find that a difficult concept to understand is the nature of the unreal nature of the universe. How could something that seems so real not be as real as we think it is? And then when you looked at, when John Dobson presented the physics of it, I thought, oh my God, it really is an unreal universe. When you look at the physics, you see that in the quantum realm and in relativity, everything depends on an observer, and that it's an observed universe. And so there's a reality behind it, and it's appearing this way. And the physics, when you go through that, explains all that. We're not going to go through all that physics tonight, but it took him about 10 lectures of 2 hours each, but he started right down at the brass tacks and went forward. But he showed how the infinite, undivided, and unchanging nature of Brahman showed through in the physics as electricity, gravity, and inertia. And that in the quantum realm, the particles existed because we observed them, and we don't know what they're doing. They don't really have a reality if we're not observing them. And so it's an interaction between us and these particles that creates the reality that we see. So in that sense, it became very easy for me to understand that this universe really does have a mysterious apparitional quality to it, which is based on a reality, and yet it's presenting itself like a magic show. And so it was a very useful model for me. All right, so let's go on with
Would you like to read a little bit?
You want me to read? Sure. Although Vedanta philosophy agrees with Christian Science in its fundamental principles, yet there is still a great difference between their respective modes of expressing the same truths. Christian Science, by denying the existence of matter and mortal mind, denies the existence of the phenomenal world and reduces it to nothingness. This reminds us of conclusions reached by some of the nihilistic philosophers of India and Europe. Hume denied the existence of mind and matter. He reduced the whole universe to a bundle of sensations, impressions, and ideas. Some of the Buddhist philosophers in India denied the existence of the universe in the same way. But this method creates great confusion in the minds of the people. For instance, I am standing before you and speaking, and you are listening. If we follow the teachings of Christian Science strictly, we shall have to deny that I am standing here and that you are sitting there. In other terms, the speaker is nothing, the hearer is nothing, the mortal mind is nothing. Consequently, thoughts and ideas are nothing. The words expressed by the mortal mind are also nothing. So only this, but not only this, but the very act of denying is nothing, because the act of denying is the act of the mortal mind. It cannot be the act of an absolute or divine mind. Quote, where God is, no other thing can exist. So there cannot be the denial of anything in God. The divine mind cannot see anything outside of itself. And as mortal mind is nothing, therefore the denial itself is nothing. It'd be interesting to hear a Christian Science theologian giving a rebuttal to this and trying to explain their position. I think he's perhaps oversimplifying it for the sake of his arguments, but I don't know the details of that enough to comment on it, but I have a feeling they would probably have some sort of an answer. I think he's exaggerating it. Of course, he's taking some things kind of literally and showing the logical consequences of it. This difficulty does not arise in Vedanta philosophy because it does not deny the existence of matter, mind, and everything that is on the phenomenal plane. Although it tells us that the world is unreal, that matter is unreal, mind is unreal, still it recognizes their existence, but adds that existence cannot be separated from the absolute existence. If Brahman or the absolute existence be all in all, then everything that exists on the phenomenal plane is in reality Brahman, or the absolute truth. The reality of the chair, the table, the earth, the sun, the moon, and the stars is the absolute existence, is divinity itself. The reality in you, in me, and in all living creatures is the same as the absolute reality of the universe. Only on account of names and forms, the one reality appears to be many. As, for instance, the one substance, clay, appears through diverse names and forms in numberless varieties, such as pots, jars, bricks, etc. So the one absolute reality, when clothed with varying names and forms, appears to be the sun, the moon, the stars, animals, vegetables, etc. Matter and mind, according to Vedanta, are not two separate entities, but different expressions of the one eternal substance, which is called Brahman in Vedanta and God in Christian Science. And of course, this would also get across the difficulty of the dualists, like Descartes. The trouble people have with Descartes is that he's got two separate realities and no way for them to interact. There's no way for the realm of the mind to interact with the realm of matter. But from the Vedantic standpoint, since they're both expressions of Brahman, that's how they can interact, is that they're both rooted in Brahman. It's not that they're two separate things. They both are different manifestations from the same reality. And again, it's a temporary reality. It's a somewhat illusory magic show type of reality, but there's still a reality there. When you're watching a magic show, there's an actual magician there and an actual thing happening, and you actually see things happening. But your interpretation of those things is faulty. And so it looks like he's doing things or she's doing things that they're not doing. And so this reality is like that. We're seeing all this diversity and we fail to see the oneness behind the variety. And that's the problem. Do you feel like another turn at reading?
No,
All right.
Yeah. I just lost my place.
Instead of
insistently denying the existence of matter, mortal mind, and objective phenomena, Vedanta tells us how to see through the multiplicity of names and forms, the one unchangeable being.
Okay, let's keep reading. Okay. Okay, hold on one second. Mrs. Eddy by now had assembled a regular church organization. It seems extremely probable that in the beginning she had never visualized her science as the basis for an organized religion. She had developed a theology largely based, it followed naturally, from the philosophy which she had borrowed from Quimby. Quimby certainly never thought of making a religion out of his discovery, but he did produce the genesis of a theological system. Mrs. Eddy took this over almost without alteration. It was from this point that her idea of establishing a church to bulwark her theology began to unfold. Her creation of a church through which to proselytize her message was indeed a magnificent inspiration, a tremendous step forward toward the goal she had been approaching so painfully, and indeed the most important single step of her career. The idea must have been born in grandeur, gradually and over a long period. Inspirations are only suddenly realized of meaning that have long hovered in the background of the mind, nor is it difficult to see how this ambition that was to dominate her life took form and grew. It was a natural derivative of the thesis developed from Quimby that she was evangelizing the original doctrine taught by Christ when he sought to redeem men. Each time she told her disciples about the miracles she could now, through the Christ spirit within her, it must have seemed more natural to speak as if from the altar of God. The first attempted meeting of the Christian scientists in 1875 had failed to become a regular procedure owing to malicious animal magnetism generated by the spiritualists who dropped in at the service. In the following year, however, Mrs. Eddy had organized her students into the Christian Scientists Association, and by 1879 she had reached the definite conclusion that she would found an established church, and the Church of Christ Scientist was formed with Mrs. Eddy as president, Margaret D. Dunshee as treasurer, and 7 directors. They applied to the state for a charter in August 6th. All proceedings for the organization of the church were conducted in the greatest secrecy, owing to Mrs. Eddy's absolute conviction that the mesmerists in the shape of Kennedy, Spofford et al. Would undoubtedly cause the enterprise to fail if they learned anything about it. Thus, Mrs. Eddy and her students acted like a group of small boys hiding from ghosts on Halloween, and when it was necessary to meet before a notary and sign the agreement of incorporation, they sought long and diligently to find a man who could be guaranteed absolutely free from the taints of malicious animal magnetism. They pored over lists of notaries to no avail until Miss Dunshee finally suggests a man in Charleston for whom she could vouch. Miss Dunshee herself lived in Charlestown, and the incorporators all met at her home and then separated and stealthily pursued their walk to the notaries by devious and winding routes. This happened on August 15th. The papers were filed and the charter issued on August 23rd, 1879. There were in all 26 charter members, not all of whom were active in the work, but were at least willing to permit their names to be used. Boston was named as the city in which the church should be established, and the purpose of the incorporation was to transact the business necessary to the worship of God. Is that insane? For some time, Mrs. Eddy had, on this weekend when her health allowed it, gone to Boston to hold services in the house there of some student who would extend some hospitality. In her absence, the Lynn service would be conducted by Mrs. Rice or some other leading student. 4, 5, or 6 members of an attendance made a good congregation in those early days. The meetings were rather simple in form. There would be prayer, a reading from Science and Health, and reading from the Bible, and then a talk delivered by Mrs. Eddy herself, whenever she was present. This was the status of her Lynn organization when revolution suddenly broke forth. Talking among themselves at first a little diffidently, a number of students found that they all agreed on the subject of Mrs. Eddy's very definitive limitations. Had Mrs. Eddy been present at these confidences, she undoubtedly would have assured the students that they were the unwitting victims of malicious animal magnetism, which was being sent forth to destroy them and her. But at the time, she was entirely unaware. The students were tired of Mrs. Eddy's outbursts, tired of being witnesses in lawsuits which had unfortunate repercussions all over the town, tired of having to explain the goings-on in Board Street to friends who thought that a new religion ought to have something to offer besides constant bickering, fears, and chambers of psychological horror. Therefore, 8 students together drew up a letter of resignation from Mrs. Eddy's organization, keeping the whole matter secret until one of them arose in the regular meetings of the Christian Scientists Association to read the document aloud. Mrs. Eddy was present as usual. As she listened, she could hardly believe her ears. Every name signed to this resignation represented one of the oldest and most prominent students in her group. The resolutions which she heard was as follows: we, the undersigned, while we acknowledge and appreciate the understanding of truth imparted to us by our teacher, Mrs. Mary B. G. Eddy, led by divine intelligence to perceive with sorrow and departure from the straight and narrow road, which alone led to grow of Christ-like virtues, made manifest by frequent ebullitions of temper, love of money, and the appearance of hypocrisy, can no longer submit to such leadership. Therefore, without aught of hatred, revenge, or petty spite in our hearts, from a sense of duty alone to her, the cause, and ourselves, do we respectfully withdraw our name from the Christian Science Association and Church of Christ Scientist. 1881. Miss Eddy was amazed. She arose and said she also expressed her indignation. She dwelt long on the vile accomplishments of malicious animal magnetism, which even then was emanating from her enemies in its attempt to destroy not herself alone, but also the 8 students who at that very moment were becoming unwitting victims. The 8 had heard all they cared to, however, about malicious animal magnetism. They went on to their homes without another word. The next day, Mrs. Eddy got up, donned her best clothes, and went forth to call upon the rebels. It is a rather pitiful picture, that of a woman. Give me one second. The next day, Mrs. Eddy got up early, donned her best clothes, and went forth to call upon the rebels. It's a rather pitiful picture, that of a woman wholly a prey to wretched impulse and delusions which she could not control, now faced with the collapse of her entire student organization in Lynn. All of the 8 students refused to admit her to their homes. Mrs. Rice has said that she came to my house and pounded upon all 3 doors with a stone. She was wild. She sent me word that she intended to have me arrested for deserting her. Mrs. Eddy did not fulfill her threat of arrest. On reflection, she adopted another course. She informed the students that their resignations were not acceptable, and that their desire to resign made them liable to expulsion for disloyalty. As always, Mary Baker Eddy intended to have the last word. She summoned the 8 to attend the next meeting. They did not appear. Instead, 2 more students resigned, stating that they could no longer entertain the subject of mesmerism, which had lately been uppermost in the meetings and Mrs. Eddy's talks. This episode marked the death knell of Mrs. Eddy's efforts in Lynn. She tried to marshal her few remaining students around her, and 4 months later, these students prepared some resolutions announcing their loyalty to the teacher. The next of this document, which bore some earmarks of Miss Eddy's own phraseology, was published in the Lynn Union in February 3rd, 1882. But these students were more recent arrivals in her circle, and their support was far less valuable than that which had now been withdrawn. Mrs. Eddy was definitely through the Lynn, and she knew it. She had indeed sensed the coming catastrophe for 2 or 3 years and had tried to prepare for it. Already she was an old woman, as ordinary lives go. For 61 years she had sought for a foothold in the world, and now once again it was necessary to move on. Okay, so now we're starting part 3. Okay, so let's watch the rest of this and then we'll continue reading.
Which stands as the background of all objects of material existence and gives reality to all. The names and forms have, of course, no absolute reality, but they have conditional reality, or in other words, they exist in relation to our minds. The world is real according to Vedanta, but at the same time, it is not as it seems to be. It is not that which appears to us at the present moment. This is what is meant by illusion in Vedanta. For example, here is a chair. The substance of the chair is the absolute reality, because the absolute reality is all-pervading in one. It is in you, in me, in the table, and in everything. That which gives reality to the chair is one with the absolute reality. The chair appears as chair only so long as it is clothed with the name and form of chair. If we can mentally separate the name and form from the substance of the chair, that which will be left will be common wood. Take away the name and form of wood, atoms and molecules will remain. Take away the name and form of atoms and molecules, there will be left nothing but eternal energy. And that is inseparable from the absolute substance. In this way, if we can mentally separate the names and forms from the substance, all phenomenal objects can be reduced to one substance, which is the absolute reality of the universe.
Yeah, my simplistic understanding of the Christian Science ideas is that if you can completely assert your identity with God and your divine nature, that you are made in the image of God, and that your body, mind, and spirit are all made in the image of God, that will bring about the healing. You create your divine, pure, perfect self. And so that's my simplistic idea of how the Christian Scientists view this. So, but I guess from a philosophical point, he's got some interesting ideas about this. All right, let's go on. He'll give some more ideas here.
Thus, Vedanta, while giving the most logical reason for the variety of phenomena, does not deny the existence of anything. On the contrary, it tells us that the real existence or true substance of everything is Brahman, or absolute reality, or God, as Christian Science calls it. The whole universe is like one infinite ocean of reality, which is nameless and formless. And in that ocean, waves and bubbles rise spontaneously and take different names and forms. These waves and bubbles are the objects of the phenomenal universe. As in the ocean, waves and bubbles have no existence separate from or independent of the ocean itself. So the waves and bubbles, known as the phenomenal objects of the universe, have no existence separate from or independent of the ocean of reality. We are like so many bubbles in the infinite ocean of reality.
Well, that's that's a footnote. The English translation of Maya is not illusion, but is delusion or nations. Okay, then the rest of the paragraph.
Our existence to that ocean, live there and play for a while, then merge into it to reappear in some other form. Such is the conception of Vedanta concerning the relation of phenomena to the absolute noumenon, or the unchangeable truth, which underlies all phenomenal names and forms. Christian Science, taking its stand on the Bible, tries to defend its position by wonderfully clever interpretations of scriptural passages in which the meaning of each passage is stretched to its utmost limit. Common sense, however, prevents many from accepting such interpretations, as they depend neither upon logic nor upon reason, but upon the authority of an inspired founder.
And of course, as we mentioned earlier, she did this because that was the audience she was speaking to. She wasn't addressing an audience that was going to be versed in the Bhagavad Gita or the Upanishads or other esoteric philosophies. She had to justify passages from the Bible. And also, one could argue that there were many things in the Bible that were twisted in a particular way. And if you read in between the lines, you can find deeper meanings that perhaps were there in the beginning, but were kind of edited out. We know that there are many apocryphal gospels, and again, we don't know how authentic all of those are, but somebody wrote them and were inspired by Christ's teachings. And so they may very well be from people that knew Christ directly and passed down their teachings. And some of them are much more Vedantic than the four canonical gospels are, indicating that perhaps to some of his more intimate disciples, he revealed ideas and truths of a more esoteric nature that might have been more difficult for his generally Jewish audience to accept. You have to realize that teachers teach to a particular audience, and Jesus was teaching primarily to a Jewish audience, and Mary Baker Eddy was preaching primarily to a Christian audience. And so they have to put things in terms that those people are going to understand. And they can't expect them to go through a university course for a degree in philosophy to understand things in a more specific way. All right, so now I've lost the place. Let's see, where are we? Oh yeah, Vedanta, inspired founder. Okay. Yeah, not upon the logic of an authority of the inspired founder. Vedanta philosophy explains. Find it?
Vedanta philosophy explains the same truths without resting its evidence upon any book or upon the authority of any man or woman, whether of antiquity or of our day. It has no founder, consequently it does not demand allegiance to anyone or to anything save truth. Christian Science, again, by denying the phenomenal universe, places itself at variance with all science and all philosophy. It also defies all modern scientific methods by restricting its field of investigation to that which is mentioned in the one copyrighted volume called Science and Health. Whereas the Vedanta philosophy, admitting the existence and relative reality of the phenomenal universe of mind and matter, accepts all the truths that have been discovered by science and philosophy, or by the seers of truth in all countries and in all ages.
Yeah, again, I never got that impression that they were anti-science at all. I never got that impression from the particular services that I attended back then, but I don't know where he's getting that particular impression. All right, let's continue.
At the same time, it tells us that the realm of science and philosophy lies within the limits of time and space, that they cannot, in consequence, go beyond relative reality.
Well, that goes for anything we say. Anything we're putting into words is automatically in the realm of time, space, and causation, and in the space of relative existence. So that really goes without saying. All right.
Christian Science does not see any harmony between absolute truth and the scientific truths discovered by so-called mortal mind. But Vedanta, on the contrary, sees perfect harmony underlying all the laws and phases of truth which human minds have discovered. Truth being one, whether it be discovered by science, philosophy, or religion, is the same truth. It cannot be many. Why should we deny its diverse aspects as long as we are on the phenomenal plane? Christian Science, to go further, is notably uncharitable towards everything not sanctioned by its founder, while Vedanta philosophy declares that truth is universal and cannot be monopolized by any man or woman of any country.
Yeah, again, I remember one of the people in the Christian Science church where I played said that Christian scientists don't claim to have a monopoly on truth. So ideas have changed, or perhaps the particular Christian scientists he was talking to had these ideas, but perhaps it's not universally held that way. Okay.
Christian Science rejects the doctrine of evolution and upholds the belief in special creation as described in the book of Genesis, attempting to explain the account there given by the idealistic theory, which was adopted by Bishop Berkeley and by a host of other idealists of ancient and modern times. Vedanta accepts the doctrine of evolution and shows that of special creation to be absurd. It also courts free investigation in the realm of nature without imposing the condition the results of all such investigations be in accord with the tenets of a specific book or of some one teacher, and it thus emancipates the human soul from bondage to any one of scriptures or to personal authority.
Of course, that was a raging debate back then, so perhaps she did have those ideas that of a more of a fundamentalist Christian idea of the creation of the universe coming literally the way it was in the Bible, but that would be part of the air of matter, you see. So there would be sort of a difference there. All right.
In this age of agnosticism and materialism, Christian Science has done an admirable work in making people realize that this phenomenal world of ours is like a dreamland, and that all objects of sense are nothing more than objects seen in a dream. This is no small gain for Western minds, because the more we realize that this world is like a dream, the nearer we approach to absolute truth. In this respect, what Christian Science is at present trying to do in this country has been done by Vedanta in India for centuries. Furthermore, Christian Science has rendered a great service to humanity by demonstrating the power of the mind over the body, the power of spirit over matter. Although this fact was in no way new to the spiritual teachers, sages, and best thinkers of every country, still in no other country and at no other time had there ever been so well organized a movement as that recently started by Mrs. Eddy under the name of Christian Science. Like Vedanta has brought health to many diseased bodies and rest to many diseased minds. Dazzled, however, by their wonderful success in healing, Christian Science does lay exclusive claim to the method of healing given by Mrs. Eddy, declaring it to be the only right method, while all others adopted by mental scientists, metaphysical healers, and other kindred sects are wrong and unscientific. We must not, however, let these extravagant claims I make by the over-enthusiastic followers of Mrs. Eddy blind us to the fact that the power of healing is the property of every individual soul. Anyone can develop the gift of healing and cure disease by the mind without becoming a Christian Scientist and without reading a page of Science and Health.
Yes. So it's interesting. I remember the story of the founder or the rediscoverer of the Reiki technique also talked about how he had read that Christ had healed and that Buddha had healed and was wondering how they did it, figured they had a method and searched for the method and finally rediscovered the Reiki healing energy technique. So it's kind of interesting that he was aware that this healing power existed with Buddha as well as with Christ. And he's going to point out that there have been many remarkable healers. You want me to read a minute?
It's about time to stop.
Almost, but we got a couple minutes. There have been many remarkable healers in every country, which, such as among the Hindus, the Buddhists, the Mohammedans, and those of other religious creeds. It is a great mistake to think that the power of healing comes from any outside source or from belief in this or that. It is developed by living a right life in accordance with moral and spiritual laws of nature. Christian Science teaches that the power of healing was first shown to the world by Jesus the Christ and his disciples, and asserts that no one ever manifested that kind of healing power before he appeared upon the earth. But if we read the religious history of the world carefully, we find that long before the birth of Christ, the same healing power of mind or spirit was practiced by the followers of Buddha with marvelous success. Wherever Buddhist missionaries traveled, they healed the sick without using drugs. The yogis in India used no drug in curing diseases, but rely entirely upon the spiritual power which they acquired through the right living and practice of yoga. Christian Science, in laying such stress upon the miraculous and exclusive power of healing manifested by Jesus, are evidently ignorant of the fact that similar Christ-like healing powers were displayed by the Asclepius, the ancient Greek who was proclaimed the savior of mankind because of these very powers. He not only cured the sick of the most malignant diseases, but even raised the dead. Eusebius, I'm not very good at pronouncing these strange names, the ecclesiastical historian, wrote in glowing terms of the gift of healing possessed by him for many years after his death. Furthermore, miracles continued to be wrought through the efficacy of faith in his name. Christ-like healing powers again were shown and miraculously performed by Apollonius of Tyana, who was a contemporary of Jesus of Nazareth. The lives of Hindu sages, Buddhist monks, and the yogis of India are filled with such descriptions of miraculous cures, and even of the raising of the dead. Vedanta philosophy, being fully cognizant of these facts, cannot therefore admit that Christian scientists, that Jesus was the first to exercise this power. On the contrary, it teaches that the power of healing is universal and cannot be confined within the boundaries of any one creed, sect, religion, or book. And of course, there's also a bit of we tend to, when people start something new, they tend to exaggerate exclusive claims to those things in order to get followers. So that's a very common phenomenon. But when you look at the overall history of things, you realize that yes, that many times through all parts of the world. I mean, if you go into the African subcontinent and the South American subcontinent, and you look at the various shamanic traditions and so forth, there are many different versions of healing, and these healing powers are brought out in various ways. And so what Christian Science does is it brings out these healing powers by emphasizing the teachings of Christ and identifying yourself with the truth of Christ. And so other methods of healing do it in slightly different ways, but the healing power is there, and you just have to have a particular way to access it. So that I don't think that detracts from the truth or the efficacy of any one way of doing it. It's just that it recognizes that there are many ways to do it. whereas each one might tell you that their way's the best way or the only way. So that's fairly typical among human endeavors, is that we tend to want to get followers and have people have a more absolute faith. Sometimes people, in order to develop a more one-pointedness, need that kind of exclusive feeling in order to keep their minds more one-pointed. But anyway, I want to wish you a very happy Bengali New Year. And we're, of course, last week was the New Year for many other states in India. And a very blessed Good Friday to you. And looking forward, a blessed Easter on Sunday. All of these things, including the spring equinox, of course, are celebrating renewal of life and regeneration, beginning of new cycles and so forth. So they all have that kind of commonality to them. And so it's a wonderful time to celebrate that. Spring, in the Northern Hemisphere, everything is coming to life. The trees are budding out and the blossoms are coming forth. So it's a beautiful time to remember that renewal of life that comes around each cycle of the year. All right, let's close with a chant. Om Purnamada.
Okay, I have to bring myself to read 5 more pages, but I'm tired. Hold on. Well, no, I'm gonna stop. This is just beginning of a chapter. Hold on. Okay, that's gonna be it for today. Okay, guys, bye.